Hey folks, George here again to discuss another interesting question in the philosophy of law. This time the debate is going to be around this question. This one is going to get into and overlay the moral question a little bit more too, which is what is the relationship between morality on one hand and law on the other hand, or ethics on one hand and law and justice, legal justice on the other hand. The two sides of the debate as they're framed here by David Adams is going to be ultimately against the legal positivists and the natural law theorists. We'll talk about what they have to say on this issue. I'm telling you right now, spoiling it for you, that the legal positivists are going to say there's no relation. There is no relation between what is legal and what is moral. These are two completely different questions. Whereas the natural law theorists are going to really try to talk a little bit more about the connection, that there is in fact a connection when something is so grossly immoral. It doesn't matter if it's set down by certain statutes, by some government or some institution, if it is so grossly immoral, like let's say slavery, or let's say what the Nazis did in Germany before World War II and during World War II. The natural law theorists would say that is no law at all, right? We'll see how this debate plays out, and we'll see what arguments and reasons they give for their positions. This first discussion then today is going to be from the perspective of the legal positivists. And today we're going to cover basically two legal positivists, two giants in the history of legal positivism. First, John Austin, and then second, HLA Hart. HLA Hart, of course, brings it and makes it a little bit more modern and gives us a little bit more modern feel to John Austin's original formulations of legal positivism. So let's get into legal positivism then, by John Austin. Let's talk about John Austin first. What he wants to say is, let's get this out of the way quick, and this is what all good philosophers like doing. There's always problems with these sorts of things, but what they like doing first is giving us a definition, right? And so today, John Austin is going to give us what is the definition of law. What is the definition of law? And the definition that he gives us is that a law is set by political superiors over inferiors. The superior having power over the inferior. So right away, we're seeing that this is a power dynamic, according to John Austin. Laws are stipulated given the power hierarchy in any society. The powerful sovereigns set a law over the subordinates, or the inferiors, as John Austin frames it. We'll see how this plays out in a little bit. The political superiors are, of course, the government or the sovereign, whether it be a king or a president or whomever, right? And of course, as I said earlier, according to John Austin, law is going to be completely separated from any questions of morality. Why? Well, let's go back to the definition, right? That's why philosophers like definitions so much. Because by definition, again, a law is something set by a political superior over the inferior. And the superiors have power over the inferior. Now, sometimes that happens in an immoral fashion, doesn't it? But it's still a law. It's still a law according to John Austin. That's exactly what a law is, right? Let's get a little bit more into this then. There are essentials of what makes a legal law a law. Number one, it's a command. A law is a command. A command by whom? Well, of course, it's a command by the political powerful, right? Furthermore, the political powerful can cause pain and offer punishments if this law is not followed, right? So all laws have punishments built into them, according to John Austin. And if there aren't punishments, then it's not how can we call this a law? That's an interesting sort of question that HLA Hart will expand upon later. Furthermore, when there is a law, there's a duty. There's a duty by the inferior to obey the law. And, of course, there's punishments if they don't obey the law, right? And that's what essentially a law is. Something set by the powerful over the inferior, and this powerful has the power to implement punishments or other sanctions if the inferior person does not follow the law, right? And so the duties that laws have and the sanctions that are imposed are very much entwined. So let's take one example that I dislike. Taxes, paying taxes. Well, unfortunately, it is the law. Unfortunately for me, excuse me. It is the law that I have to pay a lot of taxes. Yeah? And what happens if I don't pay taxes? Oof. Well, we could ask some people, what happens if you don't pay taxes? The government is going to come knocking on my door and inflict punishment upon me, right? Even throwing me into jail. Like one of my heroes, what's his name? From Jersey Shore. Is it Jersey Shore? This guy, Mike Situation something? Yeah, in any case, he went to jail because he didn't pay taxes properly. Because the government says you have a duty to pay taxes. And if you don't pay your taxes, Jersey Shore person, what's his name? Mike Situation or something. If you don't pay your taxes, you will be punished. And of course, this guy went to jail because he didn't pay his taxes. And that's what it's going to, that's why they're so intertwined. There's 3 parts to law, according to John Austin. Number 1, there has to be a wish or a desire on the part of the sovereign, right? The sovereign or the powerful have to have a wish that something is done. Then, along with that wish, there's a punishment, such that if you don't follow my wish, we will inflict this punishment or sanction. And then the third part, and this is what's very important, the third part is that the law has to be written down as a law, so that this person down here understands the law. Because it's not merely a law just because somebody has a wish, but it has to be written down, and presumably the second part has to be part of that writing, such that the punishment is written down in the law. And so let's summarize really quick. There's a wish by the powerful, and the powerful want to inflict a punishment for not conforming to their wish, and I write it down as the powerful sovereign. And that's what laws are, isn't it? As long as it's written down by the powerful person and backed up by punishments, it's not a law, right? Now, as a philosopher, I'm thinking, and this pops in my head, this counterexample. I'm like, wait a second, does that mean that parents implement laws upon their children? After all, aren't parents superiors to their children? Don't parents inflict punishments if it's not followed, if the law, if their rules aren't followed? And typically, now, a parent might not write it down as a law, but they do express it, such as don't eat cookies from the cookie jar, or ask permission, or something like that, for the cookies from the cookie jar. And, of course, when the child breaks these rules, don't parents punish their children? Are those laws then? That's something that's going to sit in the back of my head, and we'll see if John Austin addresses that later. Yeah? Let's go on then with John Austin's idea. Now, the fact that punishment is such an integral part of a law, a punishment by the sovereign, let's say, that entails that this sovereign, that this person in power is not just, the power that they have is literally might, and the power to violence, and the power of strength, such that we will impose this upon you, right? I'm thinking about my parent example. Once a child grows up, sometimes the parents don't have this power over them anymore, right? Is that a way out for John Austin to explain whether or not parents make laws? Well, maybe, but at least when children are small, parents still have power of violence, At least my parents did. I don't know about you, and I don't know about modern times here, but yeah, my parents used violence to enforce their laws and their rules upon me. Of course, they don't anymore, so now they're not sovereigns, but back then, weren't they? Let's see. Let's see. Um, it's going to be very interesting then. It's going to be very interesting that because this is the case, that it's merely the wishes and the enactments and the punishments of sovereigns. The question of morality doesn't come into the picture at all for John Austin. There is no question of morality. That is this a law? And is this a good law? Are two completely different questions according to John Austin. Those are two completely different questions. Aren't there such things as bad laws and immoral laws? Well, intuitively, I would say yes. And that would prove, intuitively, John Austin's point, that there is a separation. There is no relation between whether something is a law and whether something is moral. And that's a lot of his argument. Isn't there a such thing as bad laws? I would think so. And so with that in mind, John Austin's case seems to be proved. Now, next time, I will talk about natural law theory a little bit. But ultimately, John Austin does want to respond to the natural law theorists too. And what he will say is that what the natural law theorists say, at least according to John Austin, is that something like divine law, right, is the true law. And what John Austin is going to say is, really, just because God, whatever God does say about these sorts of issues, just because God says something, that's what makes it real law or not law? Here's John Austin's pushback against that. Break the law in an evil empire, under an evil sovereign. Break a law and see what happens. See if that law isn't a real law. Right? I can think of many nations around the world that have evil sovereigns, or sovereigns whom I consider immoral at least. And indeed, many people suffer under those immoral laws. But they are still laws. And that's going to be John Austin's point. They're laws nonetheless. A different question, or a different problem that John Austin has with natural law theorists is, how do we know what God's law is? The only law that we can know about is man's law down here on earth. Right? Now, you could read these books that claim to suggest we can know God's law. Right? But many people even disagree about those books. And since there are many different books that say different things about God's law, how should we actually know what God's law is? And that's John Austin's second argument against natural law theory. Now, to wrap up John Austin's very brief article in the David Adams Reader, here's, I think, his answer to my question about, wait, do parents make laws over their children? And here is how John Austin wraps this up. He really defines for us what a sovereign, or the political leader, is. A sovereign, and he gives us, how does he do this? By giving us a definition, right? So what is his definition for a sovereign, or the political leader, whether it be a king or a president or whomever? A sovereign, according to John Austin, is a superior who gets obedience or submission. Okay, that sounds like a parent to me still. But then let's hear his second part of this definition. And the sovereign does not give obedience to another. John Austin has finally answered my question at the back of my head, which is, do parents enact laws over their children? And the answer is going to be no, because parents are not sovereigns. Yes, parents dominate and command obedience from their children. However, parents do stand and give obedience to others, primarily the king or the president or whomever. And so, since there is somebody above a parent, right, parents don't really give laws, and parents aren't really sovereigns. Now, you might say in their own house they are. However, since in the whole world, in their whole life, they do give obedience to another, they're not really sovereigns in the same sense that the highest sovereign is a sovereign. Now let's move on to HLA Hart's formulation of legal positivism. He brings the ideas of John Austin up to date, right, so to speak, and addresses a lot of the problems in Austin's philosophy of legal positivism. And there are some problems that Hart recognizes, and we'll discuss those, and we'll see how Hart addresses and improves upon the previous philosophers' ideas. For Hart, the most important part of legal positivism is that there is this separation between morals and laws. Whether a law is moral or not is not the same as the question, is this a law? There can be immoral laws, according to Hart, and according to Austin, of course. And that's at the core why Hart, even though he's going to tweak Austin's ideas, that's why Hart is going to call himself still a legal positivist. And we'll see how he does that. So how is Hart going to distinguish between is this a law versus is this moral? Well, there's some very important distinctions to make. The first thing is, of course, that Hart is never going to deny that morality influences sovereigns. Because after all, Austin, however, did live in a world where slavery was still a problem, right? And what he wanted to do is use morality to influence the laws. He wanted to use morality to influence laws. So clearly, Hart wants us to recognize that even though is this law a good law and is this a law, even though they're separate questions, he does want to say that morality still does play a role in influencing what laws are made. And we want morality to play a role in when legislatures create laws, right? Furthermore, they're not going to deny that morality should be brought into legal discussions and influence legal discussions. Rather, the main thing to consider is just because something is immoral doesn't always make it illegal unless it's written down as a law. That's the important thing, right? And it doesn't even further go that things that are moral, things that are good, are always legal. Well, let's consider a couple of these things really quick. Even in the 21st century, what would we call it? Cheating on your spouse, I think, is immoral, right? But it's not technically illegal. You don't go to jail for this. Now, afterwards, if you go and get divorced, this will have an impact on divorce proceedings sometimes. Actually, there are certain states where if a spouse cheats, it doesn't play a role in the divorce proceedings, right? So even though cheating on your spouse is immoral to many people, it's not illegal, right? Typically. Now, what about morally good things that are not laws? Well, it's morally good to give to charity. Right? It's certainly morally good to give to charity, but there's no law that forces people to give to charity, right? And these are just two examples of how laws are different from what morality says. Again, is this a law? Is a different question from is this a good law or a moral law? And that's going to be the key idea for Hart and for Austin. However, there are problems that Hart recognized with Austin's early formulation of legal positivism. The first is that Austin's definition was inadequate. Austin said that laws are commands that sovereigns give to their inferiors. Well, that's not always true. Not all law forces people to do something, right? Now, there is a law that forces me to pay taxes. Yeah, that fits very nicely within Austin's philosophy of legal positivism. But what about the law that says the person who gets the most votes in the Electoral College becomes president. Is that really a law about forcing me to do anything or not do anything? And this is what Hart calls secondary laws. Secondary laws or secondary rules. And secondary rules are rules about making laws. How do we change the law in America? Well, those aren't really laws that are forcing me or commanding me to do anything. They're rather laws that say, if you want a new law, this is the process, this is the procedure that you must go through. And that's what Hart calls a secondary rule. And they are laws, but they're not really commands. Are they? That seems a little bit different. Furthermore, there's a big problem with Austin's original formulation because in the 21st century, many liberal societies are democracies, right? Austin's ideas of legal positivism are very clear when a sovereign is something like an absolute monarch or something like that. But in a democracy, who is really the sovereign? Well, if we go back to the ancient Greek notion of democracy, the sovereign is the demos, or the people. Now, we do have a president, but the president is re-elected or not every 4 years. So there really isn't a sovereign in place. Rather, it is a democracy where, ideally, the people rule themselves. Ideally, people vote on what the new laws should be. In a more direct democracy, of course. And so this notion of a sovereign making commands to their inferiors doesn't really fit so nicely within the democratic society, right? And so Hart wants to clean that up. Now, while John Austin spoke against the natural law theorists and tried to show why legal positivism was better than natural law theory, Hart here is going to speak against a different legal theory called legal realism. And legal realism is a more modern view, of course, that we'll discuss in a little bit, in a couple of discussions in the future now. But their theory, the legal realist theory, will suggest something like, well, really what laws are just decided by judges, by their kind of whims, and then they use reason and manufacture laws in a backwards sort of way, right? There's a lot of deduction that's used in formulating laws. And all we have to do is look at the law, and a judge, makes the law how he thinks or interprets the law how he thinks. However, the problem that Austin has with that, of course, is that that's a little bit too scientific about analyzing judges' thinking and analyzing judges', let's say, psychology and biases and things like that. However, there is this problem that the legal realists raise that Hart feels like he has to acknowledge. And this is the problem of the penumbra, the problem on the outliers, so to speak. There are these outlier problems that really illustrate the problems of legal positivism. How do we figure out what certain legal terms mean? How are we supposed to figure out what certain legal terms mean? Well, the realists have an answer to that, and they simply say, well, terms in the law are decided by the judges in the case that's in front of them, right? The paradigmatic example that Hart discusses here is, what does vehicles mean? What does vehicles mean when, for example, we see a sign in the park that says no vehicles in the park? No vehicles in the park. What is a vehicle? Hart is going to have to do then is figure out, wait a second, that's wrong, because deduction will not help us here. Deduction does not help us. Legal deduction, science, does not help us in the way that the realists might suppose. Science doesn't help us decide what a vehicle is. What definition of vehicle, for example, does a vehicle have a motor? Or might a bicycle be a vehicle? Or what about a child's big wheel, what I used to call a big wheel, but those big three-wheeler bikes that children ride on? Is that a vehicle or not? What definition is chosen, Hart is going to recognize, cannot be found by deductive logic. Rather, We have to appeal to some idea about what the law ought to be. Huh? There's the word ought. Isn't Hart acknowledging then? And the answer is yes. Isn't Hart acknowledging that morality does kind of seep in to what the law says and what a law is, right? What ought the word vehicles mean? Well, Hart has to acknowledge, you're absolutely right. We do have to allow morality in a little bit, right? However, while Hart does acknowledge this, his answer is ultimately to say, well, that doesn't prove that legal positivism is wrong. I'm going to try to fix it. The big point here is that morals like that aren't factored into every law, right? These are the cases on the penumbra, these outlier cases about vehicles, right? For example. And that's only in, let's say, 1% of the laws. But in 99% of the laws, so Hart is suggesting, there is no connection between morality and laws, right? We don't play a role in, is this a good law or is this a law? Those aren't related questions. It's only on these 1% of cases, like what is a vehicle? How do we define what vehicle is? It's only in those very rare penumbra cases that morality seeps in. That doesn't mean that we have to throw out all of legal positivism. Certainly not to Hart, at least. He suggests, yes, law has to be occupied with this question about what is a good law. However, he says, the law doesn't have to be preoccupied with the question of what is a good law. Those sorts of questions only come up in very rare instances, right? Very rare instances. Now going back, and Hart will update the criticism about natural law theory. Again, Hart has to give a little bit more leeway to the natural law theists than Austin did. What would we say, given the discussion that we had last time, the debate between Wizanski and Jackson? That is, are Nazi laws laws? The natural law theorists, of course, as we'll see in a moment in the next video, will say, no way, right? They have no problem with saying, of course, what the Nazis did, even if they say it was a law, it wasn't a real law. And here, Hart doesn't want to be heartless. No pun intended, but that is a nice little twist of phrase there, isn't there? But Hart doesn't want to be heartless and say, well, those were still laws. He is giving a little bit of acknowledgement that the natural law theorists might be right here, right? However, maybe the Nazi laws were not real laws, but at the same time, it's being a little bit too insensitive to tell all the Nazi citizens, oh, you should have broken the Nazi law because it wasn't a real law. Because what would have happened for those Nazis who did break Nazi law, or those German citizens who broke Nazi laws? Well, they were probably rounded up and killed themselves. And that's really the strength of Austin's ideas and Hart's ideas of legal positivism, right? There is this sovereign in Nazi Germany, the Nazis, right? There is this sovereign who tells you and has a ridiculous amount of power, violent power typically, right? They have a ridiculous amount of violent power. So to say that just because natural law theorists would say, oh, that's not a real law. Really? Do you think that you would have the courage to break such a law and probably lose your life at the immense power that the Nazis had in Germany at the time? State power is so strong, and that's the very point of Hart's and Austin's legal positivism. Next time we'll talk about natural law theory in great detail, yeah? Bye-bye. See you next time.